Claudia Sheinbaum is rejecting the use of American military force in Mexico as part of the U.S.'s crackdown on drug cartels. The rejection comes in response to President Trump's directive ordering the Pentagon to prepare operations for the possible use of military force against certain drug cartels. Two U.S. officials tell ABC News Trump is targeting cartels they labeled foreign terrorist organizations. The president dismissed questions on any possible plan.
Latin America's got a lot of cartels. They've got a lot of drugs flowing, so, we want to protect our country.
The Trump administration designated 8 cartels as foreign terrorist organizations back in February. The designation of foreign terrorist organization does give the government more power, but does not single-handedly allow for the use of military force, leaving it unclear as to what the administration is planning and what can be done legally.
Imagine a world where the very crop that gave rise to ancient civilizations is at the center of a fierce battle between tradition and technology, nature and science. Mexico, the birthplace of maize, has taken a bold stand by banning genetically modified corn. Why would a country reject a crop that promises higher yields and pest resistance? What risks lie hidden beneath the surface of this modern agricultural marvel?
U.S. is the largest consumer, producer, and exporter of corn in the world.
Well, if you're wondering why farmers are so concerned about their farm finances right now, they really just can't catch a break. It's not just because corn prices are below break even for most. It's the fact input prices are so high.
I never thought I was going to lose this much money, this fast.
In recent months, a significant change has quietly reshaped the corn trade landscape in North America, with Mexico playing a central role. For decades, Mexico has been the largest buyer of U.S. corn, importing billions of dollars worth annually, primarily genetically modified corn varieties. However, as of early 2025, Mexico officially banned the planting and import of genetically modified corn intended for human consumption. This development has sent ripples through agricultural markets, supply chains, and economies on both sides of the border.
Well, if you're wondering why farmers are so concerned about their farm finances right now, they really just can't catch a break. It's not just because corn prices are below break even for most. It's the fact input prices are so high.
The U.S. has lost the corn crown. We've been the world's top exporter of corn for just about every single year in history.
To put the scale into perspective, in 2024 alone, the United States exported roughly 25 million metric tons of corn to Mexico. This volume translates to about 924 million bushels and brought in around $5.5 billion in revenue. Mexico accounted for nearly 43% of total U.S. corn exports that year, making it an essential partner for American farmers and agribusinesses. These exports supported an estimated 133,000 jobs across farming, transportation, and processing sectors, roughly equivalent to the entire population of a mid-sized American city. For Mexican consumers and businesses, imported U.S. corn has been affordable, usually costing between 4 to 6 pesos per kilogram, less than 35 cents in U.S. dollars. This price point made it a key ingredient for a wide range of products, including tortillas, livestock feed, and industrial starch. The long-standing agricultural trade relationship between the U.S. and Mexico was underpinned by trade agreements like NAFTA and its successor, the USMCA. These deals aim to create a tightly integrated North American market, with American corn as a cornerstone of the supply chain. However, the start of 2025 marked a turning point. The Mexican government's decision to ban genetically modified corn imports caught many in the American agricultural sector off guard. The majority of U.S. corn production is genetically modified, with estimates suggesting over 90% of American corn is GMO. This meant that the bulk of corn traditionally exported to Mexico no longer met the country's new regulations. The ban did not come with much fanfare, but its impact was immediate and profound. Shipments of U.S. corn to Mexico were increasingly held up at the border or outright rejected. This shift disrupted the supply chain, leaving American exporters and farmers facing uncertainty and loss of income. Many Mexican importers, who had long relied on U.S. corn, began searching for alternative sources to meet demand. Interestingly, Canada has emerged as a significant beneficiary of this shift. Canadian provinces such as Manitoba, Ontario, and Saskatchewan have increased corn shipments to Mexico and other international markets. Trains loaded with Canadian corn are now heading to ports like Vancouver, ready to supply customers that once depended almost exclusively on American exports. While Canadian corn often carries a higher price tag than American corn, its non-GMO status, along with stable and transparent supply chains, is becoming increasingly attractive to importers. The reasons behind Mexico's ban on genetically modified corn are multifaceted. Public concern over GMO food safety, environmental sustainability, and preserving indigenous corn varieties are all factors. Mexico is the birthplace of corn and holds a deep cultural and agricultural connection to the crop. The government's move aligns with growing global trends that prioritize non-GMO foods, stricter chemical residue standards, and environmental considerations in agricultural trade. This new policy has introduced greater uncertainty in the U.S.-Mexico corn trade relationship. Even when corn shipments comply with USMCA tariff exemptions, importers are wary of sudden policy changes that could lead to tariffs or rejections. The instability makes planning difficult, encouraging Mexican buyers to diversify their supply sources to mitigate risk. As a result, Canada's corn exports to Mexico have grown steadily. While Canadian corn tends to be priced higher, about 20 to 25 cents more per bushel compared to U.S. corn, many buyers now prefer paying a premium for reliability, transparency, and compliance with evolving import standards. This willingness to pay more reflects a broader shift in global agricultural markets, where price is no longer the only decisive factor. Buyers increasingly value supply chain transparency, environmental sustainability, and consistent quality. Canada's rise as a trusted corn supplier has not happened by accident. For years, Canadian agricultural provinces have been investing in systems to improve traceability and environmental standards. One notable example is the Prairie Trace platform, a blockchain-based system that tracks every stage of corn production, from seed selection and fertilizer use to transportation routes and export documentation. Buyers can scan a unique verification code to access detailed information about each shipment, enhancing trust and accountability. In addition to transparency, Canadian farms have adopted more environmentally conscious practices. Many producers use renewable energy, reduce mechanized cultivation, and prioritize rail transport over road haulage to cut carbon emissions. Railways connecting the prairies to coastal ports like Vancouver have become more efficient, with shipment times improving by nearly 20% in recent years. In contrast, U.S. corn exporters face growing challenges. Ports along the Gulf of Mexico, such as New Orleans and Houston, are experiencing congestion, inspection delays, and rising transportation costs. New regulations issued by the Federal Grain Inspection Service, FGIS, have tightened pesticide residue limits and increased inspection fees, placing additional burdens on farmers and exporters. Corn shipments may now have to wait up to 2 weeks for inspection clearance, raising storage and logistical costs. These delays sometimes degrade corn quality, leading to rejections and financial losses. Furthermore, recent U.S. government tariffs on cargo ships and their components have increased shipping costs by about 25%. This spike has caused some exporters to cancel contracts or renegotiate terms under less favorable conditions. Container rates for shipments to key Asian markets have nearly doubled compared to 2024, exacerbating supply chain difficulties. As a result, the U.S. is losing market share not due to inferior corn quality, but because of logistical challenges, unpredictable policies, and rising costs. Canada and other producers, including Brazil, benefit from more stable logistics networks and trade agreements that facilitate smoother exports. These changes raise important questions about the future of North American corn trade. Is the U.S. losing its position as the dominant supplier due to its current approach to genetically modified crops, supply chain inefficiencies, and shifting market demands? Are buyers around the world increasingly prioritizing trust, transparency, and sustainability over price and volume? Mexico's ban on GMO corn may be just one part of a broader realignment. Other countries in Asia and Europe are tightening pesticide regulations and demanding greater traceability. Multinational food companies are adjusting procurement standards to align with these global trends. For American farmers and exporters, adapting to this new environment means rethinking production models, supply chain management, and market strategies. The decision by Mexico to ban genetically modified corn for human consumption is not simply a matter of trade or economics. It reflects deeper concerns that touch on public health, environmental sustainability, and cultural identity. Understanding these factors is essential to grasp the broader impact of this policy and its significance beyond the borders of North America. Corn, or maize, holds a unique place in Mexican society. It is not just an agricultural product. It is a cultural symbol deeply intertwined with the country's history, traditions, and cuisine. Archaeological evidence shows that corn was first domesticated in southern Mexico over 9,000 years ago, and it remains central to Mexican food culture, especially in the form of tortillas, tamales, and other traditional dishes. This connection to corn goes beyond nutrition. It represents heritage, community, and identity. For many Mexicans, the rise of genetically modified organisms, GMOs, in agriculture has been a source of concern and controversy. Although GMOs have been widely adopted in many countries to increase yields and resist pests, Mexico's indigenous communities and farmers have expressed fears that genetically modified corn could threaten the biodiversity of native corn varieties. Mexico is home to hundreds of distinct land races of maize, each adapted to specific climates, soils, and cultural practices. These native varieties are important reservoirs of genetic diversity, which are vital for resilience against pests, diseases, and climate change. Experts warn that cross-pollination between GMO corn and native corn could lead to genetic contamination, potentially diluting or even replacing indigenous maize strains. This would not only affect biodiversity, but could also disrupt local farming traditions and food sovereignty, the right of communities to control their own food systems. The Mexican government's ban on genetically modified corn can be seen as a protective measure, aiming to preserve this rich agricultural heritage. Environmental concerns also play a crucial role in Mexico's decision. Genetically modified crops are often engineered to tolerate herbicides or produce pesticides internally, which can lead to increased use of chemical inputs on farms. This has raised alarms about the potential impacts on soil health, water quality, and non-target species such as pollinators. There is ongoing debate over the long-term environmental effects of GMO agriculture, with some studies suggesting that widespread herbicide use can promote resistant weeds and reduce biodiversity in farming ecosystems. In Mexico, where many small-scale farmers still rely on traditional methods, the introduction of GMOs has been viewed as a threat to sustainable farming practices. The government's ban aligns with global trends towards organic and agroecological farming, which emphasize reduced chemical use, soil conservation, and biodiversity. Mexico has also committed to international environmental agreements that encourage the protection of native species and ecosystems, reinforcing its motivation to limit genetically modified crops. Public health considerations have further shaped Mexico's stance on GMOs. While major health organizations like the World Health Organization and the U.S. Food and Drug Administration have deemed genetically modified foods generally safe for consumption, there remains public skepticism and a demand for caution. Concerns often focus on potential allergenicity, unintended genetic effects, and the lack of long-term independent studies. Many Mexican consumers prefer non-GMO foods or seek clear labeling to make informed choices. In response to these concerns, the Mexican government has tightened regulations on pesticide residues in food, particularly focusing on chemicals linked to GM crops such as glyphosate. The country has lowered the maximum residue limits to align with stricter European Union standards. This regulatory tightening has made it harder for genetically modified corn, which often contains trace pesticide residues, to meet import criteria. The ban is thus part of a broader strategy to improve food safety and protect public health. The cultural, environmental, and health motivations behind Mexico's ban have global implications. Mexico's decision challenges the dominant agricultural model, centered on genetically modified commodity crops and industrial-scale farming. It encourages a more cautious, diversified, and locally adapted approach to food production. This resonates with movements worldwide that promote agroecology, biodiversity, and food sovereignty. The ban also places pressure on exporters and agricultural biotechnology companies. The United States, as the largest producer and exporter of GMO corn, faces a critical need to adapt. American farmers and companies must consider developing and marketing non-GMO corn varieties to regain access to Mexico and other emerging markets with similar concerns. This could require significant investments in seed research, crop segregation, and certification systems. Canada's rise as a preferred corn supplier partly reflects its ability to provide non-GMO, traceable, and environmentally sustainable products. Canadian farms tend to use fewer chemical inputs, adhere to strict environmental regulations, and increasingly participate in certification schemes that appeal to conscientious buyers. This has allowed Canadian corn to capture market share despite its higher cost. Beyond North America, Mexico's stance influences global trade patterns. Countries in Asia, Europe, and Latin America are watching closely as consumer preferences shift towards transparency, safety, and sustainability. Many governments are introducing stricter regulations on GMOs, pesticide residues, and food labeling. Multinational food companies are adjusting procurement policies to reflect these changing demands, favoring suppliers that can guarantee compliance with new standards. This broader trend challenges the previous emphasis on maximizing yields and lowering costs at the expense of environmental and social factors. It heralds a future where agricultural production is assessed more holistically, accounting for ecological impacts, cultural values, and consumer trust. However, this shift is not without challenges. Transitioning away from genetically modified crops could result in lower yields or higher production costs, potentially affecting food prices and supply stability. Small farmers, both in Mexico and elsewhere, may struggle to adopt alternative practices without adequate support. Ensuring that non-GMO crops meet the demand in volume and quality requires careful planning and investment. Moreover, the debate over GMOs remains highly polarized. Supporters argue that genetic modification offers crucial tools to feed a growing global population amid climate change. They point to increased resistance to pests, drought tolerance, and reduced need for chemical pesticides as important benefits. Opponents caution against unknown risks, corporate control of seeds, and the erosion of traditional farming systems. Mexico's ban on GMO corn, therefore, sits at the crossroads of this global debate. It represents a deliberate policy choice prioritizing heritage, health, and environment over short-term economic gains. It also reflects a growing recognition that food production must respect both nature and culture to be truly sustainable. In addition to the environmental and cultural factors, Mexico's ban has sparked discussions about food sovereignty and national security. Relying heavily on imported GMO corn was seen by some as a vulnerability, exposing the country to external market shocks and policy changes. By promoting non-GMO corn, including supporting local farmers and seed preservation, Mexico aims to strengthen its food independence. This approach has seen investments in community seed banks and programs to support traditional maize farmers. These efforts aim to preserve genetic diversity, maintain agricultural knowledge, and empower rural communities. They also align with Mexico's commitments under international agreements like the Convention on Biological Diversity and the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. As the world continues to grapple with the challenges of feeding billions sustainably, Mexico's stance offers valuable lessons about balancing technology with tradition, economic interests with environmental stewardship, and global trade with cultural identity. The evolving story of corn trade and regulation highlights the interconnectedness of agriculture, society, and the environment in an increasingly complex world. Mexico's decision to ban genetically modified corn has sent ripples through the agricultural and political landscapes of North America. The move not only impacts farmers and trade flows, but also highlights underlying tensions between economic priorities, regulatory sovereignty, and the competing interests of multinational corporations and local communities. Examining these effects in detail reveals the complexity of managing food production in an interconnected world. At the heart of the issue is the economic relationship between Mexico and its neighbors, especially the United States, which has long been the largest exporter of corn to Mexico. Corn is a staple of Mexico's diet and an important input for livestock feed and processed foods. Every year, Mexico imports millions of tons of corn, much of it genetically modified and produced by large-scale U.S. agribusinesses. This trade relationship has historically been beneficial to both sides, supporting American farmers and supplying Mexican markets. However, Mexico's new restrictions on genetically modified corn have disrupted this balance. By effectively banning GMO corn imports for human consumption, Mexico has created a major challenge for U.S. exporters, who rely heavily on access to this market. The ban is enforced through stringent regulations on the acceptable levels of pesticide residues and a prohibition on genetically engineered varieties, which make it impossible for most U.S. corn shipments to comply. In response, many American producers have had to look for alternative markets or adjust their production practices to develop non-GMO corn varieties that meet Mexican standards. This transition is not straightforward. Non-GMO corn typically commands a lower yield and requires different cultivation practices, making it less profitable for farmers accustomed to genetically modified seeds that are engineered for pest resistance and herbicide tolerance. The cost of segregating non-GMO crops during planting, harvesting, storage, and shipping also adds complexity. Despite these challenges, some U.S. producers and seed companies are investing in non-GMO and organic corn production to retain access to the Mexican market. This shift signals a broader transformation in agricultural supply chains, where consumer and regulatory demands are driving diversification beyond genetically engineered crops. However, these efforts are still in the early stages, and the scale of change required is significant. Meanwhile, Canada has capitalized on the opportunity presented by Mexico's ban. Canadian corn producers have been able to increase exports to Mexico by supplying non-GMO corn that meets the new regulatory standards. This has allowed Canada to gain market share despite higher production costs compared to the U.S. Canadian farms benefit from a reputation for cleaner, more sustainable agricultural practices and often operate under strict environmental regulations. Canada's success in expanding its corn exports to Mexico illustrates how regulatory differences can reshape trade patterns. It also highlights the increasing importance of product differentiation based on factors like pesticide residue limits, genetic status, and environmental impact. This evolving trade environment favors producers who can demonstrate compliance with stricter standards and respond quickly to shifting consumer preferences. The economic impacts of Mexico's ban extend beyond the agricultural sector. For example, the disruption of corn imports has consequences for Mexican industries reliant on corn-based ingredients, such as tortilla manufacturers, livestock producers, and processed food companies. These businesses face higher costs when sourcing non-GMO corn, which can translate into increased prices for consumers or reduced profit margins. In some regions of Mexico, where corn production is less industrialized and more focused on native varieties, the ban may stimulate local agriculture by encouraging the cultivation of traditional maize strains. This has the potential to strengthen rural economies and preserve agricultural biodiversity. However, scaling up native corn production to meet national demand is a complex task that requires investments in infrastructure, extension services, and market development. The ban has also sparked political debate both within Mexico and among its trade partners. In Mexico, the government has defended the measure as a sovereign right to protect public health, the environment, and cultural heritage. It has emphasized the importance of food sovereignty and sustainability as guiding principles behind the policy. Nevertheless, some sectors express concern about potential negative effects on trade relations and the availability of affordable food. From the perspective of the United States, the ban has been a source of friction. U.S. government officials and agribusiness groups argue that genetically modified corn is safe and that Mexico's restrictions are unfair trade barriers. They have called for negotiations and legal challenges through mechanisms such as the United States-Mexico-Canada Agreement, USMCA, which governs trade rules between the three countries. The USMCA includes provisions on scientific risk assessment and non-discrimination that the U.S. claims Mexico is violating. Canada's government has taken a more measured stance, supporting its farmers' efforts to access the Mexican market while respecting Mexico's regulatory autonomy. Canadian officials are working to facilitate trade and encourage dialogue between stakeholders to minimize disruptions. Biotechnology companies, which develop genetically engineered seeds, have faced criticism as a result of the ban. These firms promote GMO technology as essential for improving crop yields, reducing pesticide use, and addressing global food security. Mexico's decision challenges their market access and may influence research priorities, potentially slowing investment in new GMO traits. The companies are also concerned about the precedent set by regulatory restrictions in major markets. On the other hand, many civil society groups, environmental organizations, and indigenous advocates in Mexico have welcomed the ban as a victory for biodiversity and traditional farming. They argue that reliance on genetically modified crops can lead to monocultures, corporate control over seeds, and loss of cultural identity. The policy is seen as a way to reclaim control over food systems and support sustainable agricultural practices. The dynamic between these competing interests illustrates the complexity of modern agricultural policy, which must balance innovation with precaution, economic growth with environmental protection, and global trade with local autonomy. Looking ahead, the Mexican government faces the challenge of enforcing the ban effectively while managing trade relations. Monitoring and inspection systems need to be robust to prevent illegal GMO corn imports. Border controls, testing protocols, and penalties for non-compliance require ongoing investment and coordination. Mexico's ability to implement these measures will influence the ban's success and international credibility. For U.S. and Canadian farmers, adapting to the new market realities involves both risk and opportunity. Developing non-GMO corn varieties, investing in certification systems, and building trust with buyers demand resources and innovation. The changing consumer landscape means that markets for non-GMO and organic products are growing, but competition is also intensifying. Mexico's ban has also sparked wider discussions about the future of agricultural biotechnology and trade in the Americas. It raises questions about how regulatory frameworks can accommodate scientific advances while addressing societal concerns. The case exemplifies tensions between free trade principles and national regulatory sovereignty, especially when food safety and cultural values are involved. In the broader context, this policy shift may encourage other countries in Latin America and beyond to reconsider their approach to genetically modified crops. Several nations are already reviewing regulations or implementing moratoriums, reflecting growing public demand for transparency and sustainability in food production. Mexico's example could influence regional standards and contribute to a patchwork of differing GMO policies worldwide. The evolving situation highlights the need for dialogue and cooperation among governments, producers, consumers, and scientists. Building consensus on acceptable risks, benefits, and regulatory approaches will be critical to maintaining stable trade relations and supporting sustainable agriculture. Mexico's ban on genetically modified corn carries significant economic and political implications. It disrupts established trade flows, challenges biotechnology industry interests, and promotes alternative agricultural models. The policy underscores the importance of cultural values, environmental stewardship, and public health considerations in shaping food systems. It also reveals the complexities and competing pressures faced by countries navigating globalized markets and emerging consumer expectations. The ripple effects of Mexico's decision are already apparent in North American trade dynamics, with Canada gaining market share and U.S. producers exploring new strategies. These developments will continue to unfold as stakeholders adjust to changing regulations, consumer demands, and environmental realities. As nations around the world confront the challenges of feeding growing populations sustainably, Mexico's experience provides valuable insights into the trade-offs and opportunities inherent in agricultural policy. It illustrates that food production is not just an economic activity, but a deeply social and political one, where decisions about technology, trade, and culture intersect. Mexico's decision to ban genetically modified corn is deeply rooted in concerns about environmental sustainability and public health, reflecting a growing global debate over the safety and ecological consequences of genetically engineered crops. Understanding these dimensions is crucial for grasping why the ban was introduced and how it fits within broader discussions about food production and environmental stewardship. One of the primary environmental arguments supporting the ban relates to biodiversity, particularly the preservation of native maize varieties. Mexico is widely recognized as the center of origin for maize, where countless traditional varieties have been cultivated and adapted over thousands of years. These native strains not only hold cultural significance for many communities, but also represent a vital genetic reservoir for future crop improvement and resilience. The introduction of genetically modified corn, often engineered for herbicide tolerance or pest resistance, poses a risk of cross-pollination with native maize. Scientific studies have documented instances where transgenes have been detected in traditional corn varieties in Mexico. This genetic mixing could potentially dilute the unique characteristics of native strains, threatening the rich biodiversity that has evolved in the region. Maintaining genetic diversity is important for several reasons. Diverse crop varieties can offer greater resilience to diseases, pests, and changing climatic conditions. They also support the livelihoods of small-scale farmers who rely on seed saving and traditional agricultural practices. From an ecological perspective, a more diverse agricultural system tends to be more stable and better able to adapt to environmental stresses. Opponents of genetically modified corn argue that widespread adoption of GMO varieties can lead to monocultures, where a few high-yielding genetically engineered crops dominate the landscape. This reduction in diversity is seen as detrimental to ecosystem health, potentially making crops more vulnerable to new pests and diseases. Additionally, the reliance on herbicide-tolerant GMO crops can encourage increased use of chemical herbicides, which may have negative effects on soil health, water quality, and non-target species such as pollinators. The Mexican government and various environmental organizations have cited these risks in justifying the ban. They emphasize the need to protect native maize varieties and promote agricultural practices that are environmentally sustainable and respectful of biodiversity. This approach aligns with the precautionary principle, which advocates for caution in the adoption of new technologies when there is scientific uncertainty about potential harm. From a scientific standpoint, the debate over GMO safety and environmental impact is complex and often contentious. Many regulatory agencies around the world, including those in the United States and Canada, have concluded that genetically modified corn approved for commercial use is safe for human consumption and does not pose significant risks to the environment when managed appropriately. These conclusions are based on extensive research and risk assessments conducted over several decades. However, critics argue that these assessments may not fully account for long-term and cumulative effects, particularly on biodiversity and ecosystem interactions. They also highlight that many studies are funded or conducted by biotechnology companies, raising concerns about potential conflicts of interest. Independent research is ongoing to better understand the ecological impacts of GMO crops in diverse agricultural settings. In Mexico's case, the presence of wild and cultivated native maize varieties in close proximity to GMO crops complicates risk management. The potential for gene flow between GMO and native maize increases the challenge of preventing unintended genetic contamination. This concern has led Mexican authorities to adopt strict regulations to safeguard native varieties and local farming traditions. On the health front, the safety of genetically modified corn for human consumption is a central issue. global scientific consensus generally supports the safety of approved GMO foods. Major organizations such as the World Health Organization and the American Medical Association have stated that GMO foods currently on the market pose no greater risk than conventional foods. Nevertheless, public skepticism remains, often driven by fears of unknown long-term health effects, allergic reactions, or unintended consequences from genetic modifications. Some consumers prefer to avoid GMOs due to these concerns or ethical considerations related to food production methods. Mexico's ban reflects a precautionary approach to these health concerns, opting to restrict GMO corn until more definitive evidence can address potential risks. This position also aligns with efforts to promote traditional diets based on native maize varieties, which are considered not only culturally important, but also nutritionally valuable. Beyond individual health, the ban is part of a broader movement to improve food safety and security by encouraging agricultural biodiversity, reducing chemical inputs, and supporting local food systems. Advocates argue that these measures can lead to healthier diets, reduced environmental pollution, and greater resilience in food production. However, critics of the ban point out that non-GMO corn is not inherently free of agricultural chemicals or risks. Conventional farming methods may still involve the use of pesticides and herbicides, and lower yields from non-GMO varieties could lead to increased land use and resource consumption. This highlights the complexity of assessing the overall sustainability of different agricultural practices. Another environmental concern linked to GMO crops is the potential development of herbicide-resistant weeds. The widespread use of herbicide-tolerant GMOs can lead to the overuse of particular herbicides, which in turn can select for weed populations that are resistant. These superweeds can become harder to control, requiring alternative management strategies that may involve more chemicals or mechanical interventions. Mexico's regulatory framework for GMO corn includes limits on pesticide residues, reflecting an effort to mitigate such risks. By imposing strict controls, Mexican authorities aim to protect soil, water, and biodiversity while encouraging safer agricultural inputs. The ban also touches on socio-environmental justice issues. Indigenous and small-scale farmers in Mexico have voiced concerns about the corporate control of seeds through GMO technologies, which often involve patented seeds and contractual restrictions on saving and sharing seeds. The ban is seen by some as a way to support seed sovereignty, where farmers maintain control over their genetic resources and farming practices. This aspect underscores that the GMO debate is not solely scientific, but deeply intertwined with cultural values, economic power, and social equity. Food is both a biological necessity and a cultural expression, and policies surrounding it reflect these multiple dimensions. Internationally, Mexico's stance contributes to a growing divergence in GMO regulation. While countries like the United States and Brazil have embraced GMO crops extensively, others, such as many European nations, have adopted precautionary or restrictive policies. This patchwork of regulation complicates global trade and cooperation, but also encourages dialogue about harmonizing safety standards and addressing ethical concerns. The Mexican ban has prompted scientific and policy discussions about how best to monitor and manage GMO impacts. Enhanced surveillance, genetic testing, and participatory research involving local communities are being explored as ways to ensure that policies protect both biodiversity and livelihoods effectively. In addition, Mexico's approach highlights the importance of integrating indigenous knowledge and farmer experience into environmental governance. Traditional agricultural systems often embody sustainable practices that have evolved over generations, and incorporating these insights can enrich scientific understanding and policy design. The ongoing dialogue about GMO corn in Mexico illustrates the broader challenges of balancing technological innovation with environmental protection and social responsibility. As global food demands increase, finding pathways that ensure safe, nutritious, and sustainable food production is paramount.